Actually, I enlisted in the Naval Reserve Unit in Amarillo, Texas, right out of high school. And I did it because my buddies did it. It's not a real good reason, but anyhow, it worked out that way. So I stayed in the reserves through college, and then when I got my commission at the end of my college service, it became time to decide what I wanted to do. And unfortunately, I didn't have the eyesight to be a pilot, so I asked for the Naval Flight Officer program and was granted that. So I went to Pensacola in January of 1966 as a brand new ensign. So I wasn't the only one by a long shot, going to war. Some of my friends had already been to the war and come back while I was in college. So I don't recall much negativism about my participation or the war, or I'm sure there must have been well wishes, but I don't really have much recollection of anything negative in that regard. Certainly not from my family. I look back and I think this must have been hard on my folks, but they didn't show, much emotion, because at that point already there were starting to be pretty significant losses in the war. I was a Bombardier-Navigator, and as such, I was responsible for the navigation system and the bombing system. During the daytime, we didn't use the full extent of that system. But at nighttime in bad weather, we used it. That was the only way we could bomb. And I was basically in charge. The pilot flew where I told him to. The A-6 is an attack aircraft, which means that it's not a fighter, but it delivers air-to-ground ordnance. So it has two crew members. The pilot sits on the left seat, and I sit on the right seat. I was going to go with VA 165. When I came back from survival training, I was advised by the commanding officer that I was going over like in 5 days to replace a BN who had turned in his wings. That was a volunteer program. The Navy doesn't make people fly that don't want to. And so I went directly to the war. This squadron, VA 196, had been there for 2 months. So I flew aboard, I think on the 4th of July, 1967. And the next day was my first combat mission. So my first cat shot was with a moderate load of ordnance. The A-6 we could carry 28 500-pounders. Some of the times we carried 22, sometimes 18. But the cat shot, I mentioned that because the cat shot is set for the gross weight of the aircraft. And one of my jobs was to confirm that with the guy on the deck. Let me describe it this way. It's a 2-second experience, maybe a little more than that. And I was braced for something I had no idea what to expect. When we went off the bow, and before I opened my eyes, I thought we had crashed. That's how violent it was to someone who wasn't used to it. And I opened my eyes and realized we hadn't crashed, and I was really elated. So it pushes you against the back of the seat, and if everything goes right, you go off the bow. On one mission, one of the radio units came out of the panel and clipped my left kneecap because someone had put it in and had not secured it, and it flew out of the center console and hit my knee, and that was sore for quite a while. Coming aboard is not as violent. All the apprehension is gearing up to hitting the deck, and that's basically what a carrier aircraft does. There's no flare like landing at an airfield. You fly the glide slope down at a certain angle and a certain airspeed until you hit the deck. If the hook grabs the wire, then there is a rapid and not too uncomfortable deceleration over about 3 or 4 seconds. If you don't catch a wire, the pilot goes to 100% on the throttles and you fly around because you're landing on the angle deck, and you come around and try again. So once you get used to the cat shots, it's not a big deal. Carrier pilots and crews learn to land on a carrier before they go to a carrier. They don't start there. They're like in Whidbey Island, Washington, where I was stationed, there's an outlying airfield. That's all there is. There's just a strip, enough of a runway where they paint the carrier deck. They install the same light system, and that's where pilots learn how to fly the glide slope and the lineup. And they have the officer there, the landing signal officer, the LSO, who is talking to you. And they do that for maybe 100 times or more before they go to the carrier for their first training session. So by the time they get to the carrier, and certainly by the time we got to Vietnam, all the pilots had had hundreds of landings. Well, the strategic objectives were similar to what they would be in any conflict with an adversary, that being to disrupt their electricity generation system, the fuel oil system, the roads, the trains, any transportation that can be used in the furtherance of the conflict. The tactical considerations were more to keep the supplies from going down south. The Ho Chi Minh Trail has been talked about a lot. So we spent, in my first cruise in 1967, all of the bombing was in North Vietnam. So the whole object of that was to stop the flow of munitions to the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, and of course the guerrillas down south. Here's what happened in 1967. There were two carriers on station, one carrier for sure at any time, two for most of the time. One carrier would go into the Philippines briefly. So we had two air wings sailing around in the Gulf of Tonkin, in addition to the Air Force aircraft that were flying out of Thailand for the most part. We had a daytime commitment and we had a nighttime commitment. During the day, if we were the carrier flying day, the other carrier would fly at night and vice versa. During the day, we went in what we called an alpha strike. The attack force was made up of a certain number of fighters and a certain number of attack aircraft, standoff jammers, and standoff tankers. My first cruise, the only other attack aircraft was the A-4C, which was not designed to be to carry a considerable amount of ordnance. The next cruise we had the A-7s, and they were a much better attack aircraft. We quite often led the strike when we went in. The problem with that is that we carried so much ordnance, either 18 or 22 500-pounders in 1967, that 4 aircraft would totally obliterate the target with dust and smoke. The primary threat was from anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles. Anti-aircraft artillery was 37-57 caliber, which is effective up to 10,000 feet, maybe 12,000. The higher caliber, 85 and 100 millimeter, is probably effective up to 25,000 feet. We didn't see a lot of that, but there was some. It's like in the World War II movies where you'll see these puffs in the air and you'll fly through them, and occasionally you'll hear this clank of something against the middle of the airplane and hope it doesn't get ingested in the engines. But the main threat was over the target and rolling in. On one of our missions, where we had 4 A-6s go in, only one came back. The commanding officer was shot down, and another, he was shot down over Hanoi, and then on the egress, 2 other A-6s were shot down in China. And of those 4 crewmen, 3 perished in the ejection or the crash. 1 survived the war and was released with the POWs in South Vietnam. Because we were flying into Hanoi at night, single aircraft, down on the deck, we coasted in southeast at a place called the Armpit, a radar significant point where you get your really last good update with your bombing system. You want to have that. The better updates you get, the more accurate you're going to be. Unfortunately, we had tried twice before and our system had gone down, so we had to abort. This was our 3rd try. My pilot, his name was Brian Bryans. He was called B-Square. So B-Square said, okay, Phil, we're going in, even if we have to do manual range line, which is basically pretty much like World War II bombing. On the other hand, we were down so low that when you saw the target, if you started releasing your bombs, if you were lined up, you were going to hit it. The object was just to stay low, don't get shot down, get close to the river, and I had set my manual range line at the correct position. All I had to do was tell B-Square to hit the pickle, and we dropped our bombs and we're out of there. So our plan was to fly in behind this karst ridge, fly as far north as we could behind the ridge, pop up, and then make the last run in, the last 20 or 30 miles with no protection, because it's just a flat river delta out there. There was so much anti-aircraft fire that I, with my head in the scope as the Bombardier-Navigator, watching for the radar return, I could see the light come through the hood from the flashes of the explosion. I never saw that on any other mission. It was so intense. At one point I was curious and I stuck my head up, and it was so scary that I didn't do that again. I put my head back in there, and my pilot is pulling G's, and we're evading these triple A sites that are all up and down our path. So we evaded the AAA, we made our release, and it was just like turning off the switch. We flew into the black void of the area north of Hanoi, and we thought, well, we're glad that's over. Well, briefly, they were launching missiles in pair. At night, it's pretty easy to see the missile. There's a train of fire probably 15, 20 feet long out of the back end of that missile. So my pilot and I both were looking for the missiles. He spotted them. He was able to evade them. They fired 2 missiles. They blew up behind us, blinding flashes. I don't know how close they were. They fired 2 more. They blew up not as close. And then they fired a 3rd one, and I don't even have a recollection of it going off. So they fired 5 missiles at us. And since they didn't get us for the first 2, we were getting further away, and we were able to evade. At one point, my orientation is completely out of whack, because I'm looking at a black hole except for the lights, and there's no lights in Hanoi, they're blacked out. There's no lights in that port of Vietnam because there's nobody living there. And at one point, whenever I felt we were upside down, because you know you can feel in your straps, you're pushed up in your straps. And I looked up through the canopy, and there above us, was actually below us, was a full moon shining a reflection off of the Red River. And I pointed that out to B Square with something like, B Square, we're going to die, or something like to that effect. And he looked up, saw it, and rolled inverted, and we probably had a couple of 100 feet to spare. I don't know, it seemed like it was awfully low. But whenever I said that, I looked over to him. He was cranked around looking at the missiles, and I'm not sure he would have seen it. He might have been able to see it and save us. But that was my sole contribution. And that was after the 5th missile. That was the end of the mission. And at that time, I remember the publicity said Hanoi was the most heavily defended event that the American forces had ever gone up with, including World War II. So that's saying something. They had been fighting the French for a long time before we got involved. They had been fighting the Chinese. I mean, you go back through Vietnam history, they've been fighting somebody for a long time. So you expect them to not roll over and play dead when you show up. But certainly their tenacity was evident in a number of ways. I mean, whenever you give a guy a bicycle with a bomb on it that weighs more than he does, and he walks that bicycle from North Vietnam to South Vietnam over the Ho Chi Minh Road with nothing but a bag of rice to sustain him for 2 weeks, you got some dedicated people there. We were joined with allies on the ground, and it's not dissimilar to Iraq and Afghanistan, actually. And they did not have the will to fight and the means to fight when we first started working with them. During the course of the war, of course, that built up, but it was pretty satisfying to see a string of trucks on your scope, and then drop your ordnance and then bank and look back, and there would be the same number of secondaries and fires that you had counted on the scope. We were using cluster bombs. They started coming into their own in 66, 67. And the cluster bomb would cover the size of 2 or 3 football fields, depending on how many you dropped at once. I actually, at one point, out of curiosity, did a little bit of calculation to give you an example. As I said, we carried 18 or 22 500-pounders. So I probably said, you know, maybe 20 as an average, times the weight of the bombs, times the number of missions, and it came out to be very close to 1 million pounds. And that's just myself in one aircraft on one cruise, or 2 cruises actually, 2 cruises. Multiply that times the number of other aircraft, other services, all the years we were there, and there were millions and millions of pounds of bombs dropped. So it's a staggering amount. More tonnage than was dropped in World War II, even with all those raids into Europe and the Southwest Pacific. A staggering amount of ordnance. And of course, some of it hit the target, some of it did not. Very frustrating. It was a political war, you know. Robert McNamara seemed to be very proud of the fact that many of the missions were okayed by him personally. This is the Secretary of Defense making the yes or no decision on which site to hit and maybe even which way you came in and what ordnance you used. I don't know the details of that. But it went way up higher than most of the conflicts that the United States has been involved in. You know, I was proud to have served my country whenever they called. Certainly, well, I shouldn't say certainly. I might have done things differently had I known in 61 when I went to college and got in the Navy that we were going to be involved in a war like this. But frankly, by the time it was time to go over, I was feeling very good about it. I was feeling very proud. So what difference would it have made? I mean, you can look back after the recent wars that we've been involved in and say, should we have done that? And during the course of these last wars, I'm thinking, you know, this is bleeding our country. This is bleeding the military. We need to be spending this money on something else. I didn't get that sensation of the Vietnam War because they were pretty good times financially for the country and for the world. But that's always a consideration. Somebody has to make that decision. You know, buck stops at the White House, you know, the president's commander-in-chief. The thing that really, I guess, really was upsetting to me at the time was when we pulled out in '72. I'm pretty sure my memory is correct that in the Paris Accords, we agreed to pull out if they would release our POWs, and they did, and if they would not invade South Vietnam. And that if they did, we would come back and help the South Vietnamese. They invaded South Vietnam, and we did not. And my guess is we never really had any intention of doing that. A lot of South Vietnamese lives were lost, and of course, you've got a communist country, and all the consequences have happened with the boat people, and like you say, the Hueys, when people were, especially some of these people in the military and diplomatic positions, that was a death sentence for the North Vietnamese to come into Saigon, especially, and to capture the people who were involved in the war making one way or the other. It was at least a prison sentence for a long time, re-education, that whole thing. So I wouldn't pass any judgment on whether or not we should have not done Vietnam. There are positive consequences because of what we did. I'm not sure they outweigh the negatives of the war totally. If we had it to do over again, you know, and knew what would be entailed, 58,000 lives. If you could look at the Vietnam Wall, there's a panel there that I've been to a couple of times that I know 8 or 10 of my fellow flyers that are on that panel. And then I look at you look at the other 58,000 names on that wall and you think, it just wasn't worth it.